So over the years, I have been asked, when do you think Jesus will return? And when I say over the years, I'm talking like 30 years that I've been involved in ministry. And over the years, people have asked me, when do you think Jesus will return? And over the last 30 years, I've always given this, the same basic answer. And I think it's served me well for the last 30 years, and I feel like it's going to serve me well for the next 30 years. This will continue to be my answer. And so when people ask me, when do you think Jesus is coming back? I will typically say, I'm not on the date and time committee. I am on the welcoming and preparation committee. And so it's not my job to speculate. It's not my job to set a date or suggest a date or suggest a time. It's my job to try and get as many people ready for his return as possible. And that has been how I've answered this question for the last 30 years and will continue to be the way I answer that question. But what's interesting is almost any time any significant or unusual event takes place, you always have people that are wondering, is this it? Is this the end? What's happening? Does this have any meaning? And of course, the doomsday sayers will lean into this, and I feel like at times milk it for all it's worth, sell as many books and cassettes, that's a long time ago, but that's where I'm from, the age of the cassette, downloads, whatever it is, and so here we go again. We have Israel at war, which has been very ugly, what Hamas did, launching a major attack against Israel, hundreds of rockets. They invaded them. They've murdered and kidnapped. They've gone after just civilians. And really with ISIS-like tactics, guerrilla warfare, and Hamas is a terrorist organization. So we hate to see anything like that. And I think Israel has the right as a country, as a nation, to defend its borders, to protect itself, and to protect its citizens. So they have the right to do that. And then we don't know how long this war is going to go, right? We don't know. This could drag out for years. It could end at some point quickly. We don't know. So we don't know how long it will last. And really in this whole Middle East area, really we just need Jesus, don't we? And that should be what we're praying for as followers of Jesus. Every group in there needs Jesus. Hamas needs Jesus for sure, Palestinians need Jesus. Israel, the Jews need Jesus. Every group in there needs Jesus. And so that's what we should be praying for. And I think God is doing something. And if you go to some of the most highly Muslim countries of our day, think about Iran, Jesus is at work there. Even though the church is being restricted by government and different people, God is at work. And it's my hope in this upcoming mission month in March that we highlight what the church is doing in Iran. I think this will be very interesting for all of us, what God is doing over there. So that's our goal. I'm working towards that, being able to highlight Iran during our mission month. But God is at work in this Middle East area. But again, the question always comes up, what is happening? And does what's happening there in the Middle East right now in Israel, does it have anything to do with Bible prophecy? This always comes up when something unusual like a war starts out in that area. People wonder, does this have anything to do with Bible prophecy? And so I want to just touch on this morning. And some believe that the end time events revolve around Israel and Jerusalem, the Holy Lands, the Promised Land. And so the question becomes, does the end time revolve around Israel? And if it does, then is this the beginning of the end? And I was watching a well-known preacher this past week or two, and he said, this may be the beginning of the end. I love the way they put it, because he doesn't know. He just says, this may be the beginning. And I'm putting an emphasis on maybe, because he doesn't know. And anytime something like this happens, everybody's like, well, this may be, or some go even further and say this is the beginning of the end. And so, like I said, the doomsday prophets, sayers kind of lean into this. And so, like I said, anytime you have unusual or just significant events happening, people begin to speculate and wonder. And so I've got a book in my office where this guy has kind of accumulated the list of people that have predicted the end and been wrong. And why would I or anybody else want to add their name to the list? Are you guys with me this morning? So people from practically the beginning of time have been predicting the end. And from different backgrounds, from different lands and different people groups. And even Christians have been no stranger to predicting the end. And so I want to take you on a short journey this morning on that. And so the Baptists have done it, the Presbyterians have done it, the Pentecostals, Episcopalians, Mennonites. No group is excluded here. Even the Jews have gotten into it, the Muslims have gotten into it. And every generation of Christians have believed, or at least there's been a group in every generation of Christians that believe that they were in the end, that they were living in the end time. There's been a group in every generation. I just want to say this again. Let's get this into our heads. There's been a group in every generation among Christians that believed that they were living in the end. And guess what? They weren't. They were wrong. They were not the last generation. Every prediction of the end has had a 100% fail rate. Again, that's why I don't enter into this game. Think about it, even Martin Luther, as great as Martin Luther was, in our church and many churches across America are a result of Martin Luther. He thought the end was coming during his lifetime. And this is what he believed. He believed the Lord's return would happen in his lifetime because the world was headed towards Armageddon and a gigantic war against the Muslim Turks of his day. He believed the end was coming in his lifetime. That was about 500 years ago. Let me give you a couple others this morning. This becomes very interesting. Chuck Smith, the founder of Calvary Chapel, predicted that the last generation started with 1948, the year Israel became a nation. And I like Chuck Smith. I have nothing against Chuck Smith. He's done a great work. And we even did, at the movie series, we did the movie, The Jesus Revolution, which is based upon the revival that he was a part of. It was part of a great work of God, a great move of God. But he believed that the end was coming in 1988 based upon the 1948, and the rapture would happen in 1981. I don't know if you guys remember this. I remember this because I go back to cassette tapes. So I remember this stuff. I was in college. I graduated from high school in the 80s, went to college in the 80s, late 80s. Not that old. And so I remember this stuff. And so he claimed, now he soft pedaled. He wasn't encouraging people to sell all that they had, although there were some that did. And some other time frames, maybe I'll talk about that later. But he thought because of what was happening in Israel back then, that the end was coming in 1988 and the rapture was going to happen in 1981. But he was wrong on this. All right, how about Hal Lindsey? This is one of my favorite people to talk about when we talk about end times. Go to my next slide. We got Hal Lindsey wrote this book in 1970, The Late Great Planet Earth. And in 1970, he wrote this book saying in the next 20 years, these things are going to happen. The end is coming within 20 years. That was written in 1970. We're a long ways past 1970. A lot of our theology when it comes to end times comes from this book right here. It became very popular. A lot of my friends had it, very popular. And so back in the 1970s, he said in the next 20 years, the end is going to unfold. A lot of people grabbed onto that, ran with it, and even adopted a lot of his theology on it. And again, a lot of it was based on when Israel became a nation. But Hal Lindsey was wrong. And then he kept kind of modifying everything and changing it to keep up with the times because it wasn't actually panning out the way he thought. Go to my next one. This is one of my favorites too. I feel like I just love talking about it. 88 Reasons Why the Rapture is Happening in 1988. I remember this. Again, I remember this. So I was in college. The guy that lived in the room right next to us in the dorm, he said, my dad called me today and he said, if you call me tomorrow and I'm not there, it's because I was raptured because the rapture was coming in 1988. I think he said it's kind of sarcastically and joking, but you get the point. 88 reasons. He has 88 reasons why the rapture is coming in 1988. This guy, what was his name? Oh, Edgar Winslet. He sent a book to almost every pastor in the U.S. why Jesus was coming back. It became very popular. A lot of people knew about it. In case you're wondering, the rapture did not come in 1988. Just want to make sure I'm clear about that. Did not happen. But it became very interesting. But he sold a lot of books and probably made a lot of money. I don't know. Then when it didn't happen in 1988, he realized he was off. One calculation was off. And so he wrote another book, 89 Reasons Why Jesus is Coming Back in 1989. Did not sell as many copies. But and honestly, I wish I should have bought the book and kept it in my I didn't buy the book. I should have bought the book, stuck it in my library for just a moment like this where I could just hold it up and say, here it is, just. Anyways, so, and then when it didn't happen in 1989, then he changed it to 93 and then to 94 and here we go. One person predicted the end 13 different times. At what point do you just give up and say, it's just not going well? I think I'm going to stop just predicting the end. But people like to set dates, and again, everybody's been 100% wrong. My point in showing this is because a lot of people back in the 60s, 70s, 80s cued in on what was happening in Israel and thought that they could look at the Bible and what I call do newspaper exegesis instead of biblical exegesis, where they look at the Bible study, pull out what's saying. They look at the news and try and fit the news into the Bible and try and predict the end. And typically it doesn't work very well. And so my point in bringing this up is the church has been a bit reckless in predicting the end. Or some of those in the church. There's others that have not predicted the end. So the church at times has been reckless, or some have been reckless in predicting the end. The church has been a little reckless with prophecy and over projecting our opinions into Scripture and coming up with some, at times, very wrong conclusions. And so I think we got to be careful. And we wonder why the world maybe doesn't trust us as we think they should. Or believe our message as much. I mean, how many times can you cry wolf that the end is coming and it doesn't happen and people still trust you? And so this becomes, I think, one of the problems. And then I think some of the backlash of this is then as some preachers, they don't want to talk about Jesus coming back because we don't want to be thrown in with maybe a lunatic fringe that keeps predicting dates. And so we're careful, I don't want to be thrown in with them. And so this becomes very interesting. And Jesus gave us good reason why we shouldn't do this. In Acts chapter 1, verse 7, he said to them, Jesus talking to his disciples, he said, it's not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by his own authority. It's not for us to know. We're not on the date and time committee. We are on the welcoming and preparation committee. This is what we're on. And I think some have taken this like, well, if I don't, and this bothers me here. Some people say, well, I never gave a day and a time, so therefore I never set a date. If you gave a year, you set a date in my mind. There's no way around it. But I think some of us say, well, no, I never set a date because I never gave a day or a time. Yeah, but you set a year. Jesus is coming back this year, or he's coming back in October of such a year, whatever it is. If you give any kind of date range, to me, that's setting a date. I just don't think you can get around that. But we have a tendency, again, anything unusual happens, anything significant happens, a lot of times people start saying, is this the end? And that's something you can question. But think about how that's happened in the 60s, 70s, and 80s based upon what was happening with Israel. You think about, you go through this in the 80s, and then you got the Gulf War in 1991, and we saw churches kind of fill up because of that. They thought the end was coming, and then after a couple weeks or a couple months, they just kind of cleaned back out, and people went back to life as normal. And then anybody remember Y2K? I mean, the world was going to end, Y2K, right? And this became an interesting time. As again, you had the doomsday prophets, the sayers coming out. When 1999 was flipping over to 2000, it was going to confuse the computer language. Because you're going from like maybe a 2-digit calendar to a 4-digit, you needed the full 2000 in there. And this was going to mess up the computers and everything was going to shut down, the electrical grids and all that stuff. And there were people on TV. I listened to them. Again, I lived through this, right? And they were on TV. And he's still alive, and I'm not going to mention his name. And he is talking right now about what's happening in Israel. But this was his theology back then for Y2K. And I call it fad theology or just really bad theology, either way. But he said this, he said, what is the computer? It was a tower. Back in that day, we had the towers. Anybody remember the tower? Yeah. So we had the towers. He said, the Tower of Babel, what happened? The languages were confused. Listen to me, people. The end is coming. Computer chips are built with sand. It's one of the components that go into making computer chips. Jesus said, if you build your house on the sand, your house will fall. I'm telling you, Y2K, the languages are going to be confused. The economy is going to collapse. Society will be shut down. This is happening. And he sold this on TV. And then nothing happened on Y2K. Anybody remember? Anybody remember where they were in 1999? Yeah, New Year's Eve. I was doing a wedding. That's where I was. I was doing a wedding because we had a couple in the church that wanted to get married on January 1st. They wanted to be like the first ones to get married. So we started on December 31st, like at 10, 11 o'clock. And then we took the service into the new year, and they said, I do, after we had gotten into the new year. That's where I was. So Y2K. So the very next day, nothing had happened. And I just noticed this guy stayed on TV. How can you, after you build this up like this and give supposedly, theological reasons why this is a big deal, and then it turns out to nothing, and the ministry continues on. Anyways, Y2K, a fun time. All right, then we had, the bombing on the World Trade Centers, the airplanes flying into them, which raised a big issue. And then the Iraq War in 2003. And then just jumping a little bit forward, then we had the blood red moons in 2014, 2015. Remember all the books that were being written about the blood red moons, and this is a sign that the end is coming. And then we had COVID hit in 2020. And people again were questioning, is this the end? And then COVID became such an interesting time. Not only did we have COVID, this pandemic going on, but then we had the locusts in Africa. Anybody remember? I had forgotten about this. I had to go back and refresh my memory. We had the locusts in Africa. We had killer hornets that came to the U.S. from Asia during this time. We had social and civil unrest in America. We had the dust storm. Anybody remember the dust storm that came from Africa? They called it the Godzilla dust plume. I just love that name. I just want to say, I just love that name. Again, I grew up in the days of cassettes, watching Godzilla, right? Anyways, all right. I just wonder, what does a Godzilla dust plume look like? So you had all this going on, and people again were questioning, is this the end? And now we have this war in the Middle East. So here's what we have when it comes to the end. We have essentials and non-essentials. And if you've been here at Cornerstone Church for any length of time, you've heard me say this, that there's certain things that we believe that are essential, and we hold on to those tightly, right? These are important. Who Jesus is, what he came to do, how we come into a relationship with God. All those essential, very important, and we hold on tightly to those. But also in our faith, we have a lot of non-essentials where we have a little more liberty to disagree and say, hey, there's different ways to see this, and that's okay. And we should listen to each other, learn from each other. And we're not going to put each other down. We're not going to twist somebody's arm to try and believe the same way. But we have some non-essentials that we can say, hey, we can have some room to see these things a little bit differently. And End Times has that. It's one of these non-essentials that we can say we don't have to agree on how we think the end is going to pan out. The thing is, it will pan out in the end. That's why some people say I'm a pan-millennialist, because I believe it's going to just pan out in the anyways. Okay, let's keep going. Sorry, bad theological joke there. Anyway, so we have essentials and non-essentials. And so this end time theology is part of that non-essentials, that we don't have to agree necessarily on all of it. And a lot of it I have questions about. We dig into, we look, we study, we pray, we think about it. And so we were thinking along these lines back in 2020 when the whole COVID pandemic was hitting. And so I did a series. If you go to my next slide, we did a summer series on the book of Revelation. And I gave the 4 views, because a lot of times we only know one view of understanding the book of Revelation. I think it's helpful to look at some of the other views, not trying to change our minds, but trying to get a full understanding of what the body of Christ has believed about the book of Revelation. And honestly, I don't feel like I even have to pin myself into one view, but I want to be aware and understand the 4 views and say, hey, I'm just going to keep an open mind here, because I don't think we've figured this thing out totally. And a lot of people have been wrong about what they've been thinking and believing about Revelation. So we did that series on the 4 views, and I took one Wednesday for each view. We videoed this, and so we have this. If you want to watch, we don't make this public, but when people come and talk to me about Revelation, the end, what do you mean? I said, hey, there's 4 different views on there. Go watch these videos. It gives you a basic understanding of the 4 views. And then if you have questions, come back, talk to me. Let's talk through some of these dynamics, or maybe I can answer some of your questions from there. But that gives a good foundation of what the church has believed among different spectrums within the body. So if you want access to those 4 views, text me or message me on Facebook or come up and talk to me. I'll be glad to send you the links so that you could watch those. And then if you have any questions, come ask me. I'd love to have a conversation about it. I think it's fun to talk about and just to wrestle with these different views. And that's the goal here. Is we want to think deeply about the scriptures. We want to think deeply about life and how God's scriptures apply to our lives. We want to think deeply about these things. And so that's why I'm willing to go into these different views and wrestle through them, think through them, pray through them, because we want to think deeply about the scriptures. And a lot of times on these topics, especially end times, we've not really thought deeply. We've heard somebody say something. We've heard a teaching here or there. We've grown up with just knowing one view, and we've not looked at any other to say, hey, do I agree mostly with this view, or do I think another view would be better? So it's good to do this. So again, if you want to message me, text me, go to my next slide. And see, this is one of the reasons why we're doing this mission trip to South Texas, because we want to think deeply about the hot topics of our time period. End times is one of the hot topics. There's lots of other hot topics too, but we want to think deeply about these. And one of the hot topics is what's happening at the border. So we want to go down there and think deeply about God and the scriptures and what he has to say, and think deeply about the crisis that is going on there, and go down there and serve people and share the love of Jesus, because it's not about who's left and who's right. It's about being in it for Jesus. And I've told people before, they've come to me with problems, they've come to me with difficulties. I'm not in it for the husband, I'm not in it for the wife, I'm in it for Jesus. That's who I'm in it for. I'm not here to take a side, I'm in here for Jesus. And that's what we want to go down there. We want to see firsthand what's going on. We want to learn some history about the border. We want to show the love of Jesus to the people. And we want to think deeply about the big issues of our day. That as Christians, we're not afraid to jump into messy situations and wrestle through it and say, God, where are you in this mess? And how can we be a part of the solution? That's what it's about. And so if you want to sign up, you can sign up for the mission trip. I'd highly encourage you to do it. I think it's going to be a great trip. Okay, so going back to the message today, go to my next screen. There are 4 views when it comes to the book of Revelation, and I touch on this in this video series, and I'm not going to do this again. And we videoed it, so I don't have to do it again, although the videos could have been, we're doing so much better on our videos nowadays. I've been told I need to do them again. But anyways, 4 views. I go over the idealist view, the historist view, the futurist view, and the preterist view. Only the futurist view considers Israel to be a main player in the end times. It's the only view that considers that. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you the futurist view, why people who hold to the futurist view, which is basically they believe that most of the book of Revelation is still in the future. That's why it's called the futurist view. And I'm going to talk about why this view believes that Israel is a player in the end. And it's going to be a quick summary, so I'm not going to give you a lot of, go back, not done. All right, and then he's right on today. And then I'm going to give you a quick view on the preterist view and why they believe that Israel's not a player in it today. And that just lets you wrestle with that a little bit. And then we'll say, what do we do? What do we do? And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to kind of present these 2 views very quickly. If you have questions, you can feel free to come up and ask me afterwards. And then I'll talk about how do we move forward from here? How do we move forward? So let's get into this. I think you will enjoy this. This will be fun. I've definitely enjoyed it and looking forward to this. Okay, so let's talk about the futurist view. Here we go. Next slide. Here we go. Futurist view and why they believe, why this view holds that Israel is a player in the end times. So number 1, is God promised the land to Abraham and his descendants, right? We know if we go back to Genesis chapter 12, if we go back to Genesis 13, 15, and 17, that God made promises to Abraham and it included land, right? He said to Abraham, God changed his name, it just hasn't happened yet, according to Genesis 12. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land and I will show you. Go to verse 2. He says, I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. Go to my next verse, 6. He says, and Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. And at that time, the Canaanites were in the land, and the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring, I will give this land. This is the promise. He's giving them the land. And through other chapters in Genesis, he reiterates this promise to them. So they say, hey, for those that hold the futurist view, God gave this promise to Israel, number 1. Number 2, they say, hey, this promise is forever. And you see this in Genesis 13, 14, and 15. He says, the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had departed from him, look around from where you are to the north and to the south and to the east and to the west. All the land that you see, I will give you and your offspring. Here it is. Forever. So the futurist view say, hey, God gave them the land forever. So that means even though we're not in the Old Testament, we're now into the New Testament, or New Covenant, I should say. We're out of the Old Covenant into the New Covenant. He said, it's forever, meaning this goes beyond the Old Testament, Old Covenant, and into the New Testament. This promise is forever, and therefore this is still the land that belongs to them, not just because they've been there forever, but because God gave it to them, and they belong in it no matter what, and they should have it. And this is going to play into the end times. This is part of that theology. And you can see why. Psalm 105, verse 8 through 11. Again, this is kind of reiterated. He remembers his covenant forever. The promise he made for 1,000 generations. He made the covenant with Abraham and the oath he swore to Isaac. And he confirmed it to Jacob as a decree, to Israel as an everlasting covenant. To tell you, I will give the land of Canaan as a portion of your portion you will inherit. So again, an everlasting covenant. It's for ever. Everybody say forever. All right, just want to make sure you're still with me. All right, number 3 is divine. Again, we could spend a lot more time. I'm going quickly. Number 3, divine intervention. And this is what they would say, if you just jump down to verse 26 and 27, I think. It's talking about Israel here and how God swore to give them the land, but he also noticed that he scattered them at times throughout the lands. And they were under the old covenant, and as long as they were walking in obedience to God, they would stay in the land, and if they walk in disobedience, God would remove them from the land. And so what we've seen over the years, and the Futures View would say this, we've seen a divine intervention that when they sinned against God, they were moved out of the land, and so there was a great scattering over many hundreds of years, and they would say what we're seeing in Israel right now, what we've seen since the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, and even more so in 1948 when they became a nation, is not a scattering, but a regathering, that God is regathering the nation of Israel, or the Jews together, to become a nation. And so they're saying what we're seeing is divine intervention. And they see God bringing them back together, forming them as a nation, and bringing this about. So that's why they feel it is important, which makes sense. Matthew 24, verse 34. And then they would go to this verse. In Matthew 24, Jesus is talking about how the time of distress would be, whatever you believe that's going to happen. And he says this, he says, truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Now, this is where the Futures View says this generation, they would say Jesus is not talking to the generation he was speaking to when he said this generation, right? If I was speaking to you, I said, this generation will not pass away, it'd be the generation I'm speaking to. He said this generation, this word, this generation means born one, literally means born one. And so when they saw Israel becoming a nation, being born, they tied it in with this verse and say, hey, all these things that Jesus is talking about will happen when Israel becomes a nation. And so therefore, this is our timeline, and they start the timeline from there. That's the basics of the view. So that's why they hold to it. And you can see that. There's a lot of scriptures that lead you to that line of thinking. Let's go to the preterist view of Israel and see how their thinking is. Well, they start off with number one, the same thing, that God gave them the land. Go to my next slide. Yes, God promised the land to Abraham, right? He said, I'll give you the land. So they start with the same premise. The land was given. But they would go to point number two is different. And they would say, God gave them the land. He fulfilled the promise. He gave it to them. And they would look at Joshua 21, and it says this. It says, so the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors, and they took possession of it and settled there. And no one of all the Lord's good promises of Israel failed, but all were fulfilled. They say God gave them the land, and God fulfilled all his promises. Case closed. It's done. Okay? And they would go into Joshua 23, verses 14. It says, this is Joshua speaking here. He says, now I am about to go the way of all the earth. He's about to die. You know that with all your heart and soul, not one of all the good promises of the Lord gave you has failed. Every promise has been fulfilled. Not one has failed. But just as all good things the Lord your God has promised you have come to you, so he will bring you on to the evil things he has threatened until the Lord your God has destroyed you from the good land he has given you. If you violate the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and go and serve other gods and bow down to them, the Lord's anger will burn against you. So basically what he's saying here, hey, God has fulfilled his promise. He's given you the land. Now you have to stay obedient to stay in the land. If you violate that, he's going to move you out of the land. And we see that play out in a lot of the Old Testament. Is what we're seeing is that play out, that dynamic play out, that wrestling, them being scattered, them being brought back to the land, repenting for what they had done. And so we see that play out. So they would say, God did it. He gave them the land. He fulfilled his promise. And then they would say, number three, that Jesus changes everything. That Jesus changes everything. I know the Futures group says it's forever, and they would say, yeah, there's something to this forever thing, but things change. Jesus changes stuff. And we see that in Genesis, when we see, this is the line of thinking here, in Genesis 17, verse 10, right? Talking about the covenant with Abraham. This is my covenant with you, God talking to Abraham, and your descendants after you. The covenant you are to keep, every male shall be circumcised. And if you jump down, he's talking about everybody in his group, verse 12. And then 13, verse 13 says, whether born in your household or bought with your money, they must be circumcised. My covenant in your flesh is to be an everlasting covenant. Now, so this is what they say here. And this is where we need to start to understand this. Jesus changes everything. Notice how everything's brought together. The covenant in the flesh, which is circumcision, is what? An everlasting covenant. This verse brings all of it together. So like the covenant, the circumcision, everlasting covenant. So they say it ties it all together. But we know that circumcision does not stay the same under the new covenant. It changed. Jesus changed it. And so this is where they would say, yeah, there is a circumcision on the new covenant, but it's different. Look at Galatians chapter 6, verses 15 and 16. Paul writing says neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything. What counts is the new creation, peace and mercy to all who follow this rule, to the Israel of God. He even calls the church at that time, which was made up of Jews and Gentiles, he calls them the Israel of God. So this is how some believe that it has changed, that the cross changes things. Jesus said, don't murder in the Old Testament, the Ten Commandments. In the New Testament, he talks about hating your brother being murder in a sense. Things change. Under the old covenant, it was don't commit adultery. Under the new covenant is don't even think it. Things changed. This would be their line of thinking. Even the temple, Jesus said, destroy this temple in 3 days, I will raise it up. Everybody thought he was talking about the buildings. He was talking about himself. Jesus is the temple. And we see this change taking place. Even it goes even further into the parables that Jesus taught, and goes even much deeper, even to the point where in John chapter 15, Jesus calls himself the vine. We are the branches. That Jesus is the vineyard of God. Under the Old Testament, Israel was called the vineyard of God. Under the new covenant, Jesus says, I'm the vineyard, you are the branches. What they're saying is things have changed when you go from the old covenant to the new covenant, and you've got to understand that. Romans chapter 2, verse 28 and 29 says this, again, Paul here, a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, or only outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. So again, talking about this change that has taken place. And then even into Ephesians chapter 2, verses 14 and 15 says this, for he himself is our peace. Notice, who has made the two groups, Jews and Gentiles he's talking about, one, and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself, not two, but one new humanity out of the two. So what they're saying in this preterist view is they're saying that, hey, Jews and Gentiles, God says being Jew doesn't matter, being Gentile doesn't matter. We are one new humanity in Jesus through the new birth. That's what they would hold to and say. So they say this has changed. And then the last one, number 4 here, is a new covenant domain. They say it's not about the land anymore because that's changed. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, as the psalmist said. And in Matthew 28, we're to go into all the world preaching the gospel so that people might become saved and make disciples. Go to my next slide. Make disciples. And so he says, this is the new domain. It's not about nation building anymore. It's about kingdom building. It's about coming into the kingdom, whether you're Jew or Gentile, into one new humanity. So they would say the land is not a big deal. This is how they would view it. So you see these two sides having great arguments on both sides, kind of say, this is how the end plays out. No, this is how the end plays out. So what do we do? What do we do with all this? Well, we'll do what I've been doing for the last 30 years. If you go to my next slide. This is what we do. Here, Paul in Romans chapter 13 is talking about an event that is coming up. Notice he says, and do this understanding of the present time. It could be the present time that he's talking about is the soon fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. This was written, Romans was written in the late 50s, so 50 AD, I should say, not 1950. So late 50s, and so Jerusalem would, the Jewish war would start in around 68 and the fall of Jerusalem 70, so maybe he's alluding to the tensions that are building towards that. He says, do this, understanding the present time. The hour has already come for you to wake up from your slumber because of our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. And then he talks about what we should do. And let me give it to you real quickly as I get ready to wrap up this morning. Number 1 is maximize love. There was a great distress going on at the time, a lot of upheaval, and this is what Paul says, maximize your love. He says, owe no one anything except to love one another. For he who loves another has fulfilled the law. He says, owe nobody anything except love. And he says, love one another. This becomes even more interesting because this another, there's 2 words in the Greek for another. One is for another of the same kind, and one is for another of a different kind. It is easy to love one another of the same kind. It is harder to live one another when the other is from another kind. And you know what I'm talking about, almost like not another planet. But we're talking just somebody who's different than you, who likes to do things different, has a different personality. And he says, love one another. This is what he's saying when they were going through a present distress and big things were happening in their day. He says, maximize love. Owe nobody. The only debt we should have is to love those around us. That's the way we should view this. Love those around us. Do we do that? Romans 13, verse 9, he says, for the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. And if there's any other commandment, all are summed up in this saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. He says, maximize love. In the day and age which we live, we should be maximizing love. We don't have to speculate, set a date, suggest dates about the end. We should be thinking about how can we maximize love for maximum impact as a disciple of Jesus. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. In chapter 13, verse 10, he says this, love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore it is the fulfillment of the law. Meaning love protection, love does no harm. If I love you, I'm not gonna commit adultery with your spouse. If I love you, I'm not gonna kill you. If I love you, I'm not gonna hate you. If I love you, see, love is the basis for it all. And then number 2 here, we see in verse 13, he says, let us walk properly as in the day. He's saying maintain a pure lifestyle. Walk properly before God as in the day, not in revelry and drunkenness, not in lewdness and lust, not in strife and envy. Maintaining a pure lifestyle. Are we walking right before God? Again, we don't need to speculate. We don't need to set date, suggest date. How are we living? Paul says, hey, under the current situation that's going on, how are you living? Let us walk properly. And then he gives us these 3 sets of 2. He says, not in revelry and drunkenness, meaning, man, we should have self-control. One of the fruit of the Spirit is self-control. We ought to be living a life of self-control. He says, not in lewdness and lust, not in sexual immorality, impurity. He said, there should be a purity there. And then he said, not in strife and envy. Our lives should not be filled with conflict and strife and fighting and arguing. There should be a harmony. There should be a unity there. This is what our life should look like. Maintaining a pure lifestyle, walking as God would want us to walk. So again, when Paul was telling this church what to do in the current distress that they were under, he wasn't talking about, hey, start setting dates, start thinking about when the end is, get ready, sell all your stuff. No. He said, maintain your purity. He said, maximize your love. Owe nobody anything but love. This is what he called us back to. This is what Paul called them back to. This is what we should, when we see war breaking out in Israel or wherever, it should encourage us to know that there is enough hate out there in the world. There is enough strife. There is enough conflict that we should owe no one anything but love, that we should start maximizing love because the world needs more love. The world needs to see people walking like Jesus walked, and this should be the aim of our life. This should be the goal of our life. When we see things getting bad or see something getting worse, we should say, it's time to maximize love. It's time to make sure that we are walking right with Jesus.